Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study of the book of Jonah. Next time, we're going to get into the text, chapter 1, but before we do, I want us to talk about Jonah a bit. Now, we've spent several days introducing this book, but we've needed to because it's not like any other book in the Bible at all. And we've talked about how unique it is. We've talked about the text itself and some of the features of the text. And then we talked yesterday, last time we were together, about the history, the geopolitical history connecting Israel, the northern kingdom, to Nineveh and the Assyrians. And as we ended yesterday, we talked about the fact that the Assyrians were the superpower of the area. The Assyrians, in about 30 years, are going to be destroying the capital city of the northern kingdom and hauling God's people into captivity. Even though when Jonah happens, things are pretty good for the northern kingdom, as good as they're ever going to be. We also said that Jonah, if he's a prophet of God, knows this. Either he has the prophetic vision, or at least he has the knowledge of the people, the way things are. You know, he's contemporary with Amos. He can see what's happening, to know that judgment is imminent, and judgment is going to come through the Assyrians. And we talked about how violent and awful the Assyrians were when they conquered a people. So I hope we can understand Jonah and maybe even see nobility in Jonah. Because Jonah is prepared to die on behalf of the northern kingdom, on behalf of his people. He is. I mean, God, he's prepared to defy God and to die in the sea, maybe even to go to hell on behalf of his people. You know, Paul says the same thing in Romans about the Israelites. He said, I would die for them. If I could be punished so that they could be saved, I would do that, but I cannot. And I think Jonah has the same feelings. There are moments of humor, or at least of absurdity, in this book, but we have to, and of course he whines at the end of it. But we shouldn't think of Jonah as a trivial person or as a shallow person. I think we should think of him as a patriotic person, but our allegiance is to God, not our nation, ultimately. And our allegiance is to God even if that nation is made up of God's people. We do God's will because he's God, and we don't second guess his judgments. And that's in the book, but it's also a book about God's grace. And so part of this book, and really maybe the theme of this book, is not so much God's judgment and God's relenting as it is God trying to make us mature, to teach us to love our enemies, to see the world as he sees it. So those people in Nineveh who were going to be so awful, those were people who, when they were born, have spirits in them from God, souls in them that God had given them. God loves them too. And God loves the animals, which he says at the end of this book. And so, in the same way that the prodigal son story is not really about the prodigal son, it's about the other brother, the older brother, I think the book of Jonah is not so much about the Ninevites as it is about Jonah. I think that's clear. This is about someone's process, someone's arc, and God's attempt at moral education, or at least an education in compassion for one's enemies. If we don't understand that, then Jonah to us is either going to be a buffoon or a villain. He really is an anti-hero, and we don't know how things ended up because, as we said before, this book ends in an open question. But if we understand clearly that he knows that the children that are born in Samaria that day are going to be brutalized by the Assyrians when they get to be adults. And he knows that if he sacrifices himself to God's wrath, that Nineveh will be destroyed. And that doesn't mean the destruction of the Assyrians, but it could mean that things might not turn out the way he sees they will be turning out. That maybe it won't be quite so bad, or maybe it won't happen at all. Then we have this dimension where Jonah is us, even the best of us, and we understand that even when your intentions are good, if they're not in line with God's will, then they're not really good intentions at all. Even in our selflessness and our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for others, we can still be defiant of God. And God will take action. And ultimately, the lesson is you can't thwart God's will. God's going to accomplish his will. So it's fruitless to try to sacrifice yourself to change the course that God is determined to follow. It just is, because he's going to follow it anyway. It's going to be accomplished. And that's a lesson for us all as well. Well, tomorrow we're going to get into chapter 1. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.